see chat and such?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can share with you the chat for an audience.
Okay. Is it 10 attendees? This is the folks that are here?
Hello, everyone. This is the PG Symposium, the future of the platform work and platform economy, or platform economy and platform work. In this final session, Melissa and I are co-organized by DigiLabour Research Lab in Brazil and Open University of Catalonia in Spain. And there is the final session with a great closing keynote with Lilly Irani, Associate Professor at Communication at the University of California, San Diego, author of Chasing Innovation book and Redacted book, and many insightful articles. And in this closing keynote, she will talk about the Turkopticon from software to organize. And so, Lilly, thank you for having us. And for this presentation in this crazy time. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for organizing this incredible PhD symposium. The scholars that are gathered here have immense learnings to share, and I hope to catch up on some of the scholarship. Also, this is a place where people are developing research. The work I'm going to present today, it's based on a very long-term project, but also it's giving you an update on a way that project has turned in the kind of work that I focus on in the project with workers. And so if you have suggestions of similar projects or things that I should be reading or pushing my analysis, I would love to hear from you. And I think that we'll have plenty of time for discussion and comments. So my talk will be in probably just below 30 minutes, I think. So with that, let me share my slides. Share screen. Okay. Can you see my slides, Rafael and Melissa?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And if there's any problem with my internet connection or audibility, please just feel free to interrupt, or I've opened the chat window, so you can drop me a hint to slow down or say something again. All right, I'm grateful for the chance to be in conversation with all of you today. Thank you to the organizers of this event for inviting me to share my observations, experiences, research, and hopes for the future in a world of labor that's transforming and struggles over technology, the law, and the social relations that connect us. The workers I want to talk about today power artificial intelligence through a platform called Amazon Mechanical Turk. This is a story of how software and research helped workers gain some power, but also, over a decade, how that software became a band-aid for a flawed system. We too often hope that good research, good tools, or good intentions may spark consciousness, deliberation, collaboration, and ultimately change with the research that we do. My decade of work on digital labor suggests that this is simply not enough. For a future of work with good conditions for AI workers, we need to invest the most basic resources in workers so they can take the time and create their own spaces to organize for change. Research is not enough. Building software is not enough. Reading and retweeting is not enough. Donated money, I'll argue today, where we are with Amazon Mechanical Turk worker organizing, donated money is what Amazon Mechanical Turk workers have turned out to need to make time to organize for the future of work that they want, and to be strong enough in their organizations to collaborate effectively with academics that want to be in alliance. So what is Amazon Mechanical Turk and why does it exist? Artificial intelligence promises autonomous, almost magical automation delivered by heroic engineers and the computation power they command. This is a myth, and it hides so many workers who make AI work. 15 years ago, Silicon Valley companies were starting to face this reality head on. Trained as a computer scientist, I worked for Google for a few years. And there, I never met, but I knew there were workforces who pitched in when the automation failed, or helped to train the automation in the first place. At Google, these workers helped tune up a new search algorithm by judging which set of search results were better. They made sure advertisers' web pages did not violate Google's tobacco or firearms policies. My friends worked at similar companies and search startups to Google. There, the engineers faced challenges like teaching a computer how to see the difference between porn and not porn, something even judges in the United States have famously had a difficult time telling the difference between in the courtroom. Some of these workers needed to convert YouTube videos to text so search engines could search it and make it accessible to search engine customers. Or companies needed workers to check and correct error-prone automated transcriptions. Roboticists needed these workers to teach rolling robots going around a room how to see the difference between an immovable couch and a navigable carpet. Tech companies were encouraging all of us as users of the internet in the mid-2000s to upload more and more of our lives and our work onto their servers, but the companies had trouble understanding and organizing it all. This was the political economy that gives task to kind of invisible labor that Mary Gray and Sridhar Suri have called ghost work. These were tasks that were easy for people, but hard for computers to do. They're easy for people because we grow up in culture, learning and interacting with each other and with these objects over a lifetime. It's that knowledge, what autonomous Marxists even call general intellect. That's what AI engineers need to access and extract so they can approximate it with their AI algorithms. They can never fully automate it for two reasons. First, culture changes. One day, binders, so like, let me pull out do I have a binder on hand here? So I'm speaking to international audience. So, in the US, we call these binders, like these books, right, with the rings in it. In the US, binders are office supplies one day, but then the next day they become political satire when one of our presidential candidates, Mitt Romney, about I think 8 years ago, he announced that he had binders full of women, and that's how he was tackling diversity issues and diversity in upper reaches of government. So in a split second, with a presidential candidate making this comment that became lampooned about binders, the definition of binders as connotation as a word changed in culture. Slang changes, standards of obscenity change. The shapes and forms of buses and cars that automated self-driving vehicles are supposed to recognize, those change too. Buildings fall apart, receipts fade, and algorithms need humans to help them keep up with it all or step in when they fail. AI companies will downplay this, just as modernity tends to downplay change and decay in favor of static categories, because they want you to think that as AI companies, they make magic and we should all be grateful to them and that they deserve every cent that they accumulate.
Lily,
Yeah.
yeah. No, nothing. We thought that the slides were paralyzed. Nothing.
Oh, no.
They are working.
Just
Okay.
very slow. Amazon was no stranger to the limits and needs of AI. Their retail website hosted thousands of product vendors uploading product photos and descriptions. The patent pictured here describes a technical problem. Engineers needed to understand whether two pictures taken from different angles by different cameras or by different people were actually the same product. Rather than hiring full-time or even part-time workers to do this data work, they made a gig work platform so they could outsource. That platform was called Amazon Mechanical Turk. The platform allowed engineers and academics like the people that I work with at UCSD, to upload huge volumes of data tasks to the site and to set a piece rate per task, say a penny, one US cent per faded receipt transcribed. Workers from around the world, but mostly the United States, could access the platform from wherever they could get the access to the internet, and they could earn money doing the work. The platform did not enforce a minimum wage, and Amazon declared the workers independent contractors, which under US law says that an independent contractor is somebody who has the ability to set their own prices, to set their own working hours. And this is something that as digital labor scholars, you're likely very familiar with. This platform empowered engineers economically. It saved them the trouble and time and hassle of hiring long-term people who they would be responsible for as coworkers or as employees. And it saved them from the hassle of signing long-term contracts with business outsourcing firms when startups or researchers were changing their project moment by moment and wanted to be able to pivot without going through the transaction costs of engaging with a whole separate firm. The platform allowed for a speeding up of the rate of technological experimentation, in other words, pivoting from one engineering strategy to another and staying in sync with the volatility of finance and capital mobility. And startups whose main trade was labor-intensive data processing could claim that they were not temporary labor agencies. They weren't companies that provided janitorial services or food services like ABM or Manpower. No, these companies could claim that they were instead AI startups, convincing venture capitalists to give them higher valuations and therefore more money for less of the equity ownership stake, because the human workers that actually powered this digital temp agency were hidden behind the interface, nowhere in sight. This platform also empowered engineers culturally. I've argued in my work, the cultural work of micro work and new media and society. In their world of Silicon Valley beanbags and free smoothies, engineers didn't have to manage or deal with the awkwardness of denying their coworkers, these data processing workers, the very same perks. The platform terms and conditions declared workers independent contractors, and my engineer friends typically imagined a worker sitting in a hammock with a laptop, free to choose when they work. The platform also handled a lot of irritating parts like recruiting, payment transfer, and contract negotiations, almost like a kind of almost like a kind of HR firm that was built into the platform to manage labor relations. The requesters or employers just saw work come in. The work that they requested on the platform just came in through a spreadsheet or even mainlined into their code directly, so they never had to see or talk to the workers powering their algorithms or inquire into how they were doing. To my engineer friends, the platform was like magic. What you couldn't code, you could send out to platform workers. The cloud was not just someone else's computer, but it was really other people. And as I've argued extensively, the availability of this labor, of this factory through a convenient and technical interface made engineers feel not like managers, but like innovators living in a flat hierarchy. And so these forms of labor organization were crucial to the kinds of subjectivities of the digital laborers at the top of the kind of value pyramid of the tech industry. So one of the problems you encounter doing tech work that I want to share with you is one that's really important to workers. But before I get to that, I want to describe to you what the first way that I responded to this platform 10 years ago. So I wanted to know 10 years ago when I first heard about Amazon Mechanical Turk, I wanted to know what platform workers felt about this work that was so empowering and magical to my engineer friends. I came to this project from a history in feminism, and feminism for me had a labor politics to it. All work is valuable, including reproductive labor, famously, but not usually treated as such. It also meant people's own feelings about their situation had to ground our politics, rather than approaching them with analyses from an outside objectivity that they could not find a way to connect to. An art class in my PhD gave me an opening to explore further. To this end, I put out a survey asking what workers did and did not like about the work. I also put out a prompt asking the workers what they would like a Turkers' Bill of Rights to look like. What the 167 responses to the survey and the Bill of Rights exercise revealed was that the vast majority of workers had said that the Amazon's work rejection policies were an issue. Perhaps to placate requesters are what employers are called in Amazon speak, Amazon allows requesters to unilaterally decide whether they want to pay for the work that workers do or not. The purpose of this policy is ostensibly to enable employers or requesters to deny payment for work done in bad faith, such as spam, or very bad quality work. But the platform has no checks to make sure that the rejected work is actually bad. Nothing prevents an employer from rejecting a worker's work simply to get the work for free. The platform also has no system of feedback to help requesters and workers adjust their expectations about the quality of work that's needed. This was by far the dominant problem that workers, when I surveyed them about the Bill of Rights, what they talked about. This policy essentially punishes workers for problems that might not be their fault. Requesters might design a confusing task, leading workers to misunderstand the intent, or a worker might offer an analysis a requester didn't expect, calling a piece of furniture a Chesterfield or a couch, a perfectly appropriate Canadian English term, rather than a sofa, as is common in the US. The requester's limited perspective leads them to assume that the worker is wrong, and then Amazon's platform design and policies let them get away with it. The consequences for workers are not only lost wages and time, but also a blow to what's called their approval rating. Their approval rating is a percentage of tasks they've done that have been approved by requesters. Many requesters use this approval rating to filter out workers. When workers do hundreds of tasks for an employer who turns out to reject much of the work that they've done, it can devastate a worker's approval rating, their earnings, and in turn, their access to future work on the platform. Because requesters encounter workers as spreadsheet entries or API data feeds going straight into their code, it is easy to ignore mutual responsibility for work errors and consequences for workers. Platform policies, as well as a broader culture that privileges managerial expertise, enable this worker blame. So reading those surveys over a decade ago, I responded in the way I knew how. I designed a website and a browser tool. So important context here is a decade ago when I started this work, I was a computer science major, had a master's in computer science, human-computer interaction. I'd worked at, as I mentioned, I'd worked at Google, and I was in a PhD program in informatics. And I'd never heard of or been involved in a union. Like I mentioned, just feminism is why I became concerned with this. I had so much to learn. I designed a website and a browser tool, and Six Silverman, a classmate and an applied math major, coded up the design. Got a problem in society? We knew how to build software, much like the kinds of techno-solutionists that we have now come to critique, even if we had a leftist ethics in how we approach things as problems to be addressed with technology. So the website that we built was called Turkopticon, and what it allowed workers to do was to download a browser extension, and then as the workers browse the Amazon Mechanical Turk website, the browser extension would look up reviews that other workers had written of the work that they were finding on the Amazon website. So as they were choosing whether or not to work for a particular employer on the platform, they could just quickly click and see, okay, this person has 20 reviews, and this person has an average rating of 2 out of 5 for fairness and how they treat workers was one rating we had. Communicativity, how communicative they are, is another rating we had. Pay was another rating that we had. So the worker can make a decision to avoid employers who treat their workers badly. And just to give you a more specific, detailed view, so this is on the left, the browser button that we embed onto the Amazon website. And on the right is the review website. So we had quantitative ratings, much like eBay or Yelp, but we always maintained that these quantitative reviews were just a way of allowing workers who have to evaluate hundreds and hundreds of employers in an afternoon to decide who they want to work for. It was a way of allowing workers to quickly triage or very quickly judge, should I dig deeper into this employer or should I just avoid them and move on to a safer next one? But we also had room for qualitative comments because we wanted workers to be able to communicate with each other. We hoped that workers would build relationships with one another through this culture of commenting. And we always maintain that Turkopticon is not, as I put it once, a truth machine, but it's a machine for allowing workers to add context and engage in more qualitative interpretations and prioritization of who they want to work for. So in that sense, it was not techno-solutionist. We didn't think this was going to solve the problem, but we thought it allowed for a kind of mutual aid out of which other relationships could be built and perhaps some other building of worker power could happen. So we ran this site for about 10 years. Amazon Mechanical Turk workers came on board to help with making day-to-day policy decisions and to do community moderation work. The site allowed workers to avoid problematic employers and their rejections. And for many workers, we heard over the years, this didn't solve the problem of how Amazon organized the platform, but at least it reduced their anxiety as they went around their day as to whether they were going to face a mass rejection when they work for this next person. There was a lot, however, that the software did not do. A negative review meant that a reviewer had already gone through something awful and suffered. Someone had to try out the new employers after all, and it might be the worker who most needed the money that day or who needed to raise their approval rating might take a risk in order to make the ends meet and put themselves in the line of the untried employer's dangers. The site also encouraged workers to share information as individuals, but it did nothing to synthesize across employer reviews to find common issues that might require a more systemic solution or approach, to be approached in like a labor organizing campaign. The software could bring agreements or disagreements about specific employers among workers to the surface, but it couldn't facilitate consensus or find common points of action. A decade later, tens of thousands of workers had used Turkopticon. Many told us that it allayed anxieties while they worked, and a labor economist even did an empirical experiment and estimated that workers who used Turkopticon earned 40% more than those who didn't. And actually, that was a project that brought a lot of interesting research ethics questions to the fore. So if please, I'm happy to talk about that labor economists' well-intentioned experiment that also caused a lot of problems for workers in the Q&A, if you want to talk about that. A decade later, rejections had not gone away. The AI economy had only expanded and grown more flush with money, but Turk workers did not have an organized voice in discussions with policymakers, employers, or at Amazon, or even with academics who wanted to go work for better conditions, but didn't know what exactly was needed. After 10 years, it felt a little bit like I'd spent a decade building a mutual aid tool that had become a band-aid for a broken and exploitative corner of the academic industrial complex, ameliorating anxieties, but allowing the fundamental platform and policy problems to go on. So in 2019, 2 years ago, Six and I decided to turn Turkopticon into a worker-led and maintained project. We held a series of workshops to enlist workers interested in taking over the governance of the system and reorienting it in ways they saw fit. We also explained to workers who showed up at those workshops our own concerns gleaned over the last decade about the software as a kind of band-aid, ameliorating tensions in labor relations, but not actually addressing upstream sources of harm built into the system and policies. We got a grant from the Open Society Foundation that allowed us to pay workers $15 US an hour, so that the workers with me in 6 could learn to organize by going to organizer trainings, could have the time to talk, deliberate one-on-one with other workers to plan a transition, and to build a team that worked well together to focus on shared mission of transforming worker conditions for the better. Over the last year, this has been a transition away from being a software project run by a designer and an engineer and a few worker moderators. It has been a transition to an organizing project run by a growing team of Amazon Mechanical Turk workers with seed funding to support the time, training, and conversations needed that were skills that neither Turking nor engineering or being a critical digital labor academic had given us, me and 6. Over the past year, the team of organizers has accomplished a lot. And we have a lead organizer, longtime Turk worker, Sherry Stanley of West Virginia in the US, pictured in the upper right. Our lead organizer has been brave in being willing to speak and write publicly about these issues. And worker organizers like Sherry and her team canvass Turker forums, organize community meetings, and do one-on-one conversations to understand broad needs and concerns. They facilitate workshops to develop creative proposals for long-standing problems like the mass rejection problem that I described to you earlier. They work with a group of software engineers from Tech Worker Coalition who operate and make improvements to the software features and stability. And this alliance between kind of programmers and designers from Tech Workers Coalition with Amazon Mechanical Turk worker organizers and Turkopticon is not just about getting labor from people who have had society invest skills in them so they can acquire these server management and design skills. It's also about it's also about building inter-sector worker solidarity between workers who are usually kept apart by the interfaces of Mechanical Turk or by the designs of the Google campuses that keep the contractors far away. It's like bringing them into connection and direct relationships that can strengthen other kinds of organizing as well. So these software engineers, they make improvements to the software in line with what the worker organizers feel that Turk workers need to either fix problems or to strengthen their organizing, like adding phone numbers when we get registrations for users of Turkopticon so we can call them up and have a one-on-one conversation with them. The Turkopticon worker organizers also now have a network of mentors who help them strategize, people who have experience in labor law, labor organizing in different sectors. The details of how to do all this and how to bring all these different kinds of people together are difficult, and figuring out what kinds of community building works for highly flexible Turk workers who are chasing good paying jobs 24/7, it requires a lot of experimentation, but they're doing it. 6 and I can get hit by a bus, and Turkopticon will not only survive, but be able to address problems that the software couldn't. This year, the team did a survey of Turkers to ask what issues they thought Turkopticon should focus on. The top issue? Just like 10 years ago when I did the Turkers Bill of Rights survey, it was still mass rejections. But moving forward, we've given up the hope that the software and information sharing will spontaneously generate a coordinated strategy for change. Those were the dreams many had for Facebook, blogs, and Twitter, that many individuals sharing online could enable the envisioning and pursuit of political change. We see this in a lot of civic tech research, for example. But we've all seen this dream also crash hard. Organizing work is not just about communication or even engagement, but about creating focus, consensus, and trust relationships, I've learned. I'm convinced that this is what is essential for a future of work that works for the workers that power AI. So why is organizing necessary and not just software? The rejection problem, take the mass rejection problem that came up 10 years ago, and it came up in the Turkopticon worker survey this year. This mass rejection problem is not on any policy or labor agenda that I know of, but as debates about the AI and the gig economy rage, more typically around employee classification, It's important to note that the pain workers feel most directly is not necessarily what gets the attention of policymakers, academics, or the press. Unless workers organize and come to see the connections between the policy issues, like employee misclassification or wages, and their own immediate conditions, like getting rejected and having their ratings tank, these prescriptions can be perceived as top-down impositions. Turk worker organizers have a long road ahead, including coming up with proposals to the rejection problem. They tell me that a good solution, it needs to uplift the good faith work that workers do. It needs to exclude workers who are spamming and threatening the integrity of what they see as their craft of doing data processing to power AI. And the solution needs to prevent baseless rejections and repair harm when it happens. Proposals have to navigate how work interacts with disability benefits, workers' ability. So disability benefits in the United States, in order to, when somebody has a disability that makes it difficult for them to work, they actually need to keep their income under a certain level or they will lose access to their healthcare. And so the details of the strange ways in the US that the healthcare system is organized actually affect what kinds of solutions workers want to see in the Mechanical Turk platform and which kinds of things they don't want to see. And so digital labor is always embedded in a complex of other kinds of institutions that make the workers available, that workers depend on for their social reproduction, that are going to affect what their workplace demands are. Proposals to deal with mass rejections are also going to have to navigate the fact that many workers do this work because it allows them to juggle caregiving responsibilities. And some of them value that and don't particularly want to put their, some of them might not want to put their child in childcare in order to go out to a job, but they'd rather be paid well for a job that they're doing at home. These are just a sampling of the host of considerations that only come out when people that are directly doing the work and have concrete experiences start evaluating different ways of tackling the problems that they face. Improving work conditions means accounting for these unanticipated dependencies and embeddings. Good designers are trained to recognize this complexity, but they are rarely accountable to the users on whose behalf they advocate. And this is the subject of my book, Chasing Innovation. They are accountable to those who pay them for their time. In pro bono work, designers are too often accountable just to themselves and their own visions of the right and the good. As Six and I built and maintained Turkopticon over a decade, we tried to be accountable to workers, but ultimately our day jobs, in my case, I was working at UCSD, Six was working for a union that was separate from the Turkopticon organizing, and those day jobs prevented us from spending the time it takes to communicate constantly with the workers you're organizing with, to see the complexities they navigated, and to make decisions that were truly accountable to them. Yet, Six and I found that we were the ones invited to convenings put on by policymakers, academics, and even tech companies to speak about the problems of Turk work. This is a problem. In the United States, there's a long history of policy bodies or journalists consulting by the book experts, managers, engineers, and academics, privileged people in a technocratic or knowledge economy formation to speak on issues of public concern. Today, we can add nonprofits that are run by such by-the-book experts to fuel what Meredith Whittaker of AI Now has called the, quote, critical academic industrial complex. Such convenings can channel resource investment, the money that's available to deal with digital labor. That money gets channeled into people with credentials like me and Six, rather than developing workers' own abilities to collectively develop an analysis in a network of people that they trust, and to collectively speak for themselves and articulate a way forward. Six and I tried resisting this over the years, getting organizers and journalists to invite AMT, Mechanical Turk workers, to speak. And sometimes organizers and journalists did bring out workers to speak directly, but then this created its own problems. When invited workers advocated a point of view not broadly supported by other workers back on the Turk forums. The product of such inclusion efforts, when not backed by collective organizing and consensus building, was conflict and mistrust by those who felt those among workers who felt misrepresented. This mistrust was both towards the workers who were speaking at the convenings and the bodies that invited those workers themselves. So a future of work that is good for workers requires us to invest in workers' collective capacities to pursue changes to the problems they face in their own workplaces. Investing in their collective capacities includes figuring out how to get them the time off the job they need to imagine, communicate, organize, strategize, and design. We should not be looking to academics or designers in our social division of labor, people like me and Six, no matter our good intentions, to represent the will of workers. We should not be cherry picking individual workers as a voice in the room, outsourcing the burdens of representing a group onto a token person's shoulders. We also must be careful in how we choose topics in our attempts to support workers' movements. We live in a time when right-wing populisms mobilize with stories about Bill Gates imposing his latest expert plan on the people. Many communities have also raised their voices to reject academic projects that extract, or worse, undermine the goals of communities. Whether we're approaching the critiques from the right or the critiques from people who we might want to include in the left, we can strive to write in solidarity, not with abstractions such as labor, but with actual workers who are engaged in trying to improve their working conditions and their lives. And we can do so by taking stock. One aspect of doing so is to take stock of our own working conditions. We can take stock in our own investments, in the exploitation of those who are in solidarity with. You know, how much does our lifestyle depend on Uber drivers getting us back and forth quickly, or tuk-tuk drivers or auto rickshaw drivers getting us back and forth quickly in some of the ways that Sarah Sharma has written about, or the exploitation, in my case, of adjunct and temporary lecturers, or my colleagues using mechanical Turk workers for fueling their graduate students' research careers. By taking stock of our own investments, we also find points in which we can be in solidarity that might fall out of our academic purview, but might actually be crucial to intervene in, because those points of intervention are connected to how we live and work in our position, in our mode of production. We can write what we write about labor, knowing the difference between our job, even as critical researchers, and the political work, which must exceed what our institutions will recognize and reward in the research papers that we publish. So for Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, the best thing that many of us can do right now is to give workers time by helping raise funds for them. I and other people working with Tech Worker Coalition have recently helped fundraise in the United States for Rideshare Drivers United, Uber Lyft Drivers Union, in addition to Turkopticon. And fundraising is not only about the money, it's also about, you know, even if you don't have the money to donate, as many might not, it can be about reaching out to other people who may have the resources to donate. In reaching out to other people, you're building a one-on-one relationship with someone. You're educating them about digital labor conditions that you are concerned with as a researcher. You're educating others about the importance of movement organizing rather than relying on policy experts. And you're giving people who might not show up at a picket line or do labor research, you know, you're giving them a chance to invest in this movement and to invest their values. When people chip into movements, they also connect directly to organizing workers and become available in the future for other kinds of mobilizing and power building. Fundraising builds resources, it builds relationships, and it's a crucial part of building power. In conclusion, only after workers create shared agendas can our other skills, knowledge projects, and the institutional legitimacy we are granted as researchers support them. This can be a hard thing for academics to hear, because, you know, we hope to make our job changing ideas and changing theories of the world through research and education. It is easy to forget that this becomes its own kind of idealism. It can be a hard thing for design researchers to hear, because we're trained that our researchers will make technology better for people. We are rarely trained in how our own accountabilities to our jobs and the structure of our work embedded in labor relationships that are exploitative of others directs us towards problems that are seen as theoretically significant or technologically novel, and away from what the kinds of support workers invested in improving their jobs may actually feel like they need more in the near term. Solidarity rather than charity means we give not because others are worse off, but because we recognize a system that harms all of us as workers and needs to change. All right, well, thank you so much for being here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Lilly, for your amazing keynote and very powerful regarding the future. And future is a buzzword, and maybe a brand buzzword about the future of the work and the future of labor. And in the last decades, or in the end of the last century, the people talked about the end of work. So it's very interesting. My first question to you regarding your path, in amazing path from Turkopticon software to organizing. You put in the final about the differences between your job and as academic work and political work. In this symposium, we talked a lot here on action research and how to engage with workers from below. What's your understanding as action research, or whatever word, about this as a method, and what's the challenges doing this type of research about balances between research, organization, and dissemination of science?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I'm sure we will. I don't have the answer, but it's something that I want to talk about with everybody, and we can figure out together in terms of how it works in our field. I think I've been very influenced by the Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney on this. So when I was in that same class where we built Turkopticon, the late tactical media artist Beatriz da Costa had us read this piece. And I had to read it like 3 or 4 more times over the years. And the farther I got into academia and interdisciplinary academia, like the more I got out of it. But my understanding of this piece is that we will, at least I will take everything I'm saying as US academia, because I've not been in European academia or Latin American academia. And so, translating some of these arguments into your experiences may be different, but in the US academia, what I took from that article was that, people can try to reform the university by creating, say, ethnic studies departments that add the knowledge of people who have been marginalized and oppressed and racialized. This is actually more Roderick Ferguson's work, the birth of the interdisciplines, or in Moten and Harney specifically are writing about the discipline of planning, and how the discipline of planning, like it can have, they can take they have their conservative journals, and they can start a critical journal that's for exchanging views and approaches that are more radical, but they're still publishing and they still have to be legible. Like those journals are still in the language and structures and modes of community of academia. It's just translating the critique into a form that's legible for tenure letters and for institutional credit and promotions and hiring and all that. And so that will always, they argue that will always bring work into a kind of managed and logic. Now, I don't think you have to foreclose all the features of that kind of work, but it did kind of sensitize me to some of the ways that, when I propose action research, I'm still saying that, well, I'm a researcher and I will only give you my labor time if I can make it into something that counts for my job. And I realize I'm a professor with tenure, and so take everything I say with a grain of salt. Like, this might not be something that you tackle, but I sometimes, so like when I was doing the assistant professor work and like working my ass off in grad school, I started to think I would really rather have a 40-hour work week and fight to have academic, like the requirements of getting and keeping a job in academia. I'd rather have those requirements just lessen and have more time that's uncounted by the institution to just engage in politics and be a person out in political community than to fight to have my work that I do out there counted and recognized by academia. Like that's one thing I mean when I say recognizing the difference between your job and your politics. And I think the second thing for me is like I felt like, so I was doing Turkopticon. I published like maybe like 2 papers related to Turkopticon because in HCI I can get away with, if it's a technology, then I can write about it. But fundraising for Turkers, like that's not something I can like write a research paper about probably. And so I felt like I was doing this work, and then I was getting brought into these circles of like civil society, future of work kinds of foundation things, and kind of exhausting myself. And in the process of exhausting myself, these projects were not strengthening my relationships to Turkers or strengthening Turker movements. They were just putting me as a critical academic at the table of some kind of academic, technocratic, like foundation funded exercise to like come up with regulations that would quell dissent. And so I was being exhausted, and I was not, and I was in a way that was recognizable for my job, but did not strengthen the things that I thought I was writing about. And I think it took me a long time to sort of go through that process over and over, and then going to these workshops and feeling like I can't quite tell the truth. Like people would be talking about things like solutions to digital labor problems. And I remember just thinking sometimes like this makes no sense. Like you have to change, like you have to make it illegal for Amazon to do this kind of thing, or you have to require, a way for them to consult with workers. But that feeling when something is off the table, like, to me, like the space of politics is a space, is making sure I have spaces where things are not off the table and then we can speak truth. And if I don't see any of those, I don't think I saw those spaces in my life for those like first 10 years, because, and some of you might come from a more history of organizing. So this is my own naivete that was being lifted. But, I thought Meredith's thing about the critical academic industrial complex was useful because it was kind of flagging the ways that we can be made to feel that things are political and activist when they're actually kind of about containing dissent and keeping political relationship building manageable for the power structure. Another really good book, just to wrap up this comment, is The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. It's really based on like the role of like US foundations historically in funding activists globally as a way of making the world safe for capitalism and against communism. But the authors have very practical assessments of like, well, sometimes you need funding to make it possible for people who are not middle class and don't have like a salary to then like volunteer at night to participate in your movement. But you also need a part of your movement that's not dependent on funding so that you can say no when the founder tells you not to approach certain topics. Like, so that would be a reference I suggest for folks if they're interested in digging deeper. Did that address your question properly? Or usefully, like
yeah, very useful. And maybe Melissa can do the question.
Yeah. Well, first, like I'm just not going to be that formal. I need to say something. Don't be hard on yourself. Like I really feel that you're being really hard on yourself. Like, okay, you don't need to know everything. And you tried it really hard and you obtain like really, really awesome goals. Being in the academia, which we know it's not perfect, and we know all these problems. So I think that from that side, okay, you're doing an amazing job, and you are trying, like you're pushing yourself even further, trying to go beyond your comfort zone. So that's great, and it's wonderful. So that's like the first thing I needed to say. And I could like spend like asking you a lot of questions, but I was also like, so I feel really connected to what you are saying also, because I also get into research, basically trying just to make changes. I'm really connected to action research. I'm also like feeling bad, you know, because I spend time publishing and I don't spend time just contributing to the community who basically it's part of my research. I also feel this paternalist feeling of, okay, unions, even unions, some certain unions, and also like the political discourse is not centered on their actual needs. This is not what they are asking, and it's very difficult. So I'm like in this also in this situation. So I could like
Thank you for sharing that. Okay,
yeah,
so we're
so
seeing a
yes.
pattern here.
Yeah, and also feel like the same in regarding like action research, you know, like, yes, we are trying to do something, but at the end, you need a process. You need to really get them into the whole research process. They need to be part of it. They need to be, you know, like I'm not the owner of this knowledge. I hate being called expert or something like this. I hate it. I think the knowledge, it's co-produced and they know much more than I am, you know, no? So I feel like also this, like it's, so we being in academia where you have like all these requirements in order, you know, like just to fight for a job position, to be able to, you know, just make a living, and at the same time, you know, trying to help others with these time constraints, with, you know, having to publish everything, it's like a mission impossible. So that's part of it. But at the same time, you like dropped a lot of possible like avenues. First, like okay, here we are talking a lot about interdisciplinarity, the possibilities that we have also, like you know, trying to bring workers from the beginning and doing it, you know, these funds also, research funds also need to tackle this, you know, like it shouldn't be only focused in these academia publishing requirements, etc., which we know it's very difficult to change, but at the same time, you know, like I also think of this as an opportunity. And I wanted also to say something regarding so now it's you kind of evolving toward Opticon, no, into a worker-led software or whatever.
We talk about it as like an advocacy organization, and software
Great.
is just a tiny thing that they do. It's like
Great.
an organizing group. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, first, like coming back, all the, of course, like all change, and it's not only software. That's like baseline. We need to tackle a lot of things. Even when we are talking now about platform labor today, I was like constantly thinking, okay, what happens with the equipment industry, you know? So we are only focusing on what's happening with the algorithms, but come on, let's be real. The only problem here is not the algorithm, or even, you know, with the current regulation, legislation, and, you know, here in Spain with the writers' law, etc., they are like putting the focus on the algorithm management system and saying that, you know, like you have to put just some human decision there. Like if humans were like always taking good decisions and ethical decisions and we were perfect, like it's, yeah. So yeah. I totally understand you. But I was also thinking that at the end, this project, it's connecting a lot, you know, like I was like, why, and I know it could lead to really like what you don't want it to become. So there's also a dark side from this, but I feel like it could have a lot of connection with a lot of cooperatives that are trying to do something, and you know, like build connections between them. And yeah, I think one of the key aspects that you're mentioning, it's great that as a software, as a computer scientist, you are trying to do something. And I think the what we should do, or what we should try to do now, it's basically to build these bridges and trying also, like, you know, to basically produce these things together based, of course, on workers' needs and users' needs, etc. So yeah, I just wanted to leave this to the yeah, to basically to the aspect. And I wanted to ask you exactly about this, because you were also saying, okay, I'm in the US. US it's different from Europe, it's different from South America, of course. So also actually the experiences of the workers, the Amazon Turkers, etc., are way different in different places. You were mentioning the need basically just to strengthen collective action. So I was wondering first, like, how do you see these the differences between the different countries and this call for action? And so so for instance, when you were saying this about the Medicare, that they basically don't get access to it. Here we also see another problem, that basically, since they have it, they still work on the platforms because they have access to health. So I was wondering if you have like further insights into this, and how basically also software could in this case be adapted to different contexts or whatever needs, or I don't know, or these different needs. And the other thing, what do you think then about AB5 and the ProAct? Which I think it's also something positive, no? In this in this moment.
Yeah. So I was making notes because you said a lot of really important stuff. I just wanted
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, and then ProAct. So I guess I'll start with the ProAct because it almost seems like the easiest. I'm not speaking for Turkopticon. I'm not speaking for like Turkers with my answer about the ProAct right now. The talk that I gave like is something that the workers I organize with like reviewed and like they're down with it, but they don't have a position on the ProAct as far as I understand. Personally, I think the ProAct is in the United States is good because it will make it easier for workers to engage in collective action. And one of the ways it'll make it easier is by creating the federal, it takes the ABC test for independent contractors that basically says like, if you drive all day for Uber and Uber requires your labor to make money, then you are probably an Uber employee. It makes that into federal law. So, regardless of what state somebody lives in, I think that's good. I think for mechanical Turk workers, the ProAct, like it's like obviously helpful for Uber drivers in a way that it's not clear to like we're still a few steps out with Turk workers, because Turk workers are in a situation where they work on a platform. They work on Amazon is like a temp agency that matches them up to an employer that's like at a company, like say like LinkedIn or something like that. And so it's more similar to a joint employer relationship, maybe, where in the US, like Marriott Hotels as a corporation will subcontract with a janitorial firm and a food service firm and like a hotel management firm, or like Marriott subcontracts to the hotel management firm subcontracts to the janitorial services. So there is like a legal basis for holding Marriott responsible for how the janitors are treated through joint employment law, but that's that I don't hear anyone really talking about that so much. Vina Dubal is actually the person who pointed that out to me. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that making people able to feel more protected and organizing is good. The dark side of this, you mentioned cooperatives. So I'd be curious what the dark side of the outcomes to this organizing could be. I will say that sometimes I hear people talk about, oh, we could have a platform cooperative and you could have something like Amazon Mechanical Turk, but it's cooperatively operated. Like we have these like very monopolistic tech companies now. And so how is a co-op that provides like AI data processing services supposed to compete with a monopoly that provides like 90% of the internet's cloud? like if you want to run any kind of AI thing, like Amazon is the company that you're probably going to end up with. If not Amazon, then Google or Microsoft, for like hosting your data and running your compute in a way that's scalable. And so for you to decide as a consumer engineer that you're going to go to this like fair labor co-op and use them instead is like creating a lot more complexity for your engineering process than just using the thing that like Amazon already has as like an interface integrated into its sort of stack, right? And I don't know, didn't Rosa Luxemburg say something about how cooperatives, like they can't compete? The cooperatives can also be subject to self-exploitation when they are when they have to compete with providers who can provide a more exploitative and less expensive version of the same service. So I think like in order for the cooperative to work, then you'd also need state policies that like require funding to go to co-ops. Eric Olin Wright writes a little bit about this in Envisioning Real Utopias, which is a book that I'm obsessed with. And if anybody wants to talk about it, please, like, let's. He talks about in Quebec in the 70s, there was a big childcare movement, and the tons and tons of cooperatively run childcare and providers formed. I think like something like 70% of the childcare in Quebec is cooperatively run. But essential to this was that the movement didn't only form co-ops, it also changed the law so that the government of Quebec would only provide state funding for reimbursing your childcare expenses to like these cooperatively formed things. So you could go to a private provider if you're rich enough and you had the money, but the government wasn't going to pay for it. So it made a law that made cooperatives viable. So I would love to hear us talk more about that part of the picture and how co-ops have to be part of like political movements that make them structurally viable. He also talks about Mondragon, so like, Latin America is like probably way ahead of the US on all of this, and like the kind of discourse about it is way ahead of us. So sorry if I'm like North American splaining anything.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lily. And for us, the things about around co-ops is really powerful, and I really like the work of Eric Olin Wright. So we have a question from an audience or from Q&A. Fong Huan Le asks, thanks, a lot to think about. At the end of your talk, you told us to reflect on our own practices. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on fairly compensation workers for their cooperation in our surveys, interviews, and other forms of research. I've been struggling with this because research budgets are limited.
Yeah. Fong, I don't know where Fong is located, but I feel that in the I think there's like kind of two options you have. Like one is struggle where you are to get more of those funds available for workers. Like I know that at UCSD, if like professors have access to money if they just want to go like put in the application for it, and the quantities of money that academia runs on are huge compared to what workers are getting paid for projects. It's like a graduate student costs in the UCSD like $16,000 US dollars for 3 months, and running a study with workers is like a couple of $100s. It's just so. I would be hard pressed to believe that you couldn't do the extra work to find the money to pay workers something that would be considered closer to like a living wage. And then if you absolutely can't find the money, then I wonder if you should be doing that research. Maybe there's a different research project you could do that would actually, if there's a research project that you could do where like workers actually, the people you need actually want the answer to the question, maybe they will participate in the research in a more voluntary way because they would actually get something out of the exchange. And so maybe you can redirect your question to something the community finds worth investing in with their time and labor. Yeah, I don't know if there's other thoughts, please feel free to put them in the chat. But I think that sometimes graduate students also can just be afraid of asking their professor for more funds. Like if the professor is like, oh, we don't have that in our NSF grant, get together with a couple of other grad students and say, okay, how are we going to pressure the professor to go find enough money to like pay these people properly? Make it a little movement where you are. A movement doesn't have to be pickets, a movement can be building collective relationships and then cleverly finding the pathways to get someone who has the power to change the decision you need changed to change our decision. Can happen in lots of ways.
Excellent. And in Brazil, the ethics committee prohibited to pay workers, and it's very so.
So they only want voluntary participants in research, basically?
Yeah, only voluntary. And if we apply for funding to destinate some funds to workers' interviews, the research was not approved here. It's very important.
For us, it's also this way. Like if we want like to pay the worker, we like it's more problematic. They consider it more ethical not to pay.
Yeah.
To the interview. So
I can kind of see how I feel like paying very little is almost worse than paying. My personal opinion is that paying very little, like very, very, very little, is almost worse than not paying at all. Because if the person's not getting paid at all, they can just go find, they can go find something that pays more, that pays at all. But I can imagine some people would disagree with me on that. I just wonder, like in the United States, like there's this Supreme Court decision. It's going to sound like it's a different topic, but it's related. And it's like the Janus decision basically said that unions were no longer able to just charge people off their paychecks to contribute to the union. Because like I think the unions in the United States had something called fair share fee, where the union, even if someone was not a member of the union, took a little bit off the paychecks of workers in order to fund the union activities, because the idea is that everyone benefits from the union contract. And like on the one hand, like I totally get that, and that's right. Like I had dental insurance even because like someone else was in a grad student union when I was in school. But I do think that it also forces the union to have a more direct and engaged relationship with the rank and file, like because they have to get the rank and file to choose to be in the union instead of just like spending the money on like political lobbying and stuff. And Jane McAlevey is a US organizer and political scientist who's written a lot about the drift of unionism in the US to more top-down political donation methods. So I guess the connection is like maybe this forces us to do research that communities really feel like is going to strengthen them, that they need to invest in.
Excellent. I have another question, Lilly. You were one of the first researchers to talk about Amazon Mechanical Turk and micro work, and today there is a lot of research and researchers on this, including a recent book by Phil Jones in The Guardian, published yesterday. And people in Brazil, whoa, we discovered micro work. And how do you see this research, this many research and the strengthening of this research agenda, and what is still missing in this research agenda?
I think so I think sometimes the proliferation of research in micro work, I think if to the extent that the research in micro work emphasizes that this kind of labor is actually necessary to a lot of the technological change that policymakers and the public is anxious about, or like AI, robotics, etc. I think that's something that's useful. But sometimes I think people read the microwork research as a kind of dystopia of like, oh no, like this can even happen to North Americans, or this can even happen to the college educated. And I think research that uses microwork as a dystopian future does a disservice to all the people who already have been rendered invisible and whose essential contributions have been devalued in the ways that we saw during COVID. Like the people who we needed the most in the, at least like in the US during COVID, are the people who get paid the least, like, you know, like healthcare workers, elder care workers, childcare workers, food preparation people. So I think that's something that we need to be cautious of. And I think what's missing is using the, like, just getting people to actually invest in like workers themselves, developing this kind of collective will and voice that I've been talking about. You know, the kinds of money that gets made publishing about this stuff doesn't actually, rarely makes it back to workers. But there are people who are data scientists who have donated because they know they need this labor and they want workers to have a voice. Just to give a concrete example of like workers having a voice, like something that's happened a lot in academia over the last 10 years. It's like people saying, okay, we want to treat workers better. How should we treat you better? Like, give us like 10 things that we can tell our IRB, or give us 10 things that we can tell funders to like, or tell this conference to require as ethical practices. And the workers are like, well, actually, like, there's a lot of things that are really controversial, even among workers. And we don't even have the time and resources to like have that conversation among ourselves. And so when I think this mass rejection campaign that Turkopticon organizers have organized, where like they've gotten workers from different forums to say, yes, this is a problem we face, is so important, because that's like a building block. They're like, we agree that we don't want mass rejections to happen. And through the relationships they form through that, then there's more strength and ability to have more controversial debates about things like wages. But I kind of feel like sometimes the scholarship on digital labor and microwork, we just want to jump in and like come to those conclusions ourselves for what's right for the workers. And like, you're going to find workers who like disagree with your conclusions, but you're not embedded in a way that makes you able to, one, know that, and two, kind of pace out the way you publish your research to help support the campaigns that workers are actively engaged in. So like worst case scenario, huge debates on micro labor and all the proliferation of research actually distracts the public sphere from the thing that the actual workers dealing with this stuff really want to see Amazon move on. Because like mass rejections are like not on a research agenda, like they're not theoretically interesting enough. Thank you for the very provocative question. Like no one's ever really asked me that before, and I've never quite like laid it out like that before. I would like a recording, I think. Oh, I know it's not recorded.
I
Damn.
need to know your answer. It's an important answer as one of the first researchers that talk about it.
It's not even because I'm the first. It's like because like I think it's like having been around a long time does help, because I see these patterns, but also more important is that like I hear this stuff from like Sherry and other workers. So you know, they're constantly like monitoring what's being said, and like I hear their play-by-play of like, oh, this is so frustrating the way this narrative has been framed. Like they hate the narrative of the low wages, for example, because they make it feel like everybody pities them, the dystopian future problem, instead of like pointing the finger back at the employers who could be paying more but don't. That's one tiny example of like how engaging with workers can change the way that you frame the research that you're doing, even if your data, you know, is the same.
Great. I really like the article by Nupur Raval saying stop call workers as invisible workers or ghost workers or something like that. Mm. And incredible piece by Nupur Raval, and I will share with you. Melissa, can I do the Q&A or you?
Me?
Melissa, okay. Okay.
It's yours, yes. Don't worry.
Okay, great. We have another Q&A here from Riaz Shaky. I think this is. It's wonderful to listen to you again after in the HCI. Thank you. Lilly, do you think we need to look beyond academia and use other fields to originate the action research from?
I think I know I'm looking to I wouldn't say go to other, well, depends what you call a field, but I'm definitely going to other practices. Like I'm going to the practices of people who've been involved in social movements and people who are really trying to change how policies work as a place to learn. So, like reading the accounts of like labor organizers or people who've been involved in like transnational movements, like Revolution Will Not Be Funded. The book No Shortcuts by Jane McCalvey has been very helpful to me. So yeah, I definitely think we need to look beyond academia for sure. How much time do we have? Because I teach class in 15 minutes.
Yeah, we are finishing
the job.
This was the last question. Thank you so much, Lilly, for your insightful keynote. For us, I learned a lot, and thank you for having us. I don't know if Melissa can add some words.
I don't want to steal her more time. Just it was a pleasure meeting you, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me here, and I hope that this is just another step in a long conversation. So I invite everybody here to drop me an email. Maybe we can get together as a group and talk about things that came up for us. I would love that.
Sure.
Excellent. And for me, this symposium was a great pleasure to work with Melissa, Open University of Catalonia, and other many early career researchers. We are here. Thank you so much for all of you.
Same.